She had lived a whole life before me. Yet somehow, she saw mine more clearly than anyone ever had. I noticed her in a moment that should have been forgettable. Late afternoon lights slanted through the windows, dust drifting lazily in the air. The kind of quiet that settles after a long day. I was halfway distracted, thinking about deadlines, unfinished dreams, the usual noise in my head, when she stepped into the room and somehow softened everything. She didn't rush. Her movements were unhurried, confident in a way that came from knowing herself rather than trying to be seen. A simple outfit, elegant without effort, framed her posture. Relaxed shoulders, chin slightly lifted. When she paused to take in the space, it felt like the room adjusted to her presence, like the air itself leaned in. Our eyes met by accident. Or at least that's what I told myself at first. The glance should have ended there, polite, brief, meaningless. But it didn't. She held it a moment longer, a small, knowing smile touching the corner of her mouth. Not flirtatious, not distant, just open. I felt something tighten in my chest, a quiet awareness that I'd been noticed in a way I wasn't used to. When she spoke, her voice was calm and warm, carrying a steadiness that made me listen more closely than I meant to. I answered too quickly, then laughed at myself, suddenly aware of my own nerves. She seemed amused, not by me, but with me. That distinction mattered even then. She handed me something. Papers? A book? I barely remember. And as I took it, her fingers brushed my wrist. It was brief, almost nothing, but it lingered. Her touch was warm, grounding, and it sent a small, unexpected shiver through me. I looked down instinctively, then back up, half expecting her to apologize or pull away. She didn't. Instead, she met my eyes again, calm as ever, as if she understood the effect of that small contact and wasn't afraid of it. There was a history in her gaze. Not secrets exactly, but experience. Laughter that had survived disappointment. Confidence that had been tested and rebuilt. Standing there, I felt younger than I had that morning, not in a childish way, but in the sense that my life still felt like it was opening outward, while hers carried depth and weight. We exchanged a few more words, nothing personal, nothing risky. Still, when she turned to leave, I caught myself watching the way she moved away, the soft rhythm of her steps, the quiet certainty she carried with her. The space she left behind felt strangely empty. As I went back to what I'd been doing, I realized my focus was gone. Not because of desire alone, though that flicker was there, but because something about her presence had unsettled me. She hadn't tried to impress me. She hadn't crossed any lines. And yet, I felt seen, as if she'd looked past the surface and found something worth noticing. The next time we spoke, it felt less like a coincidence and more like an inevitability. We found ourselves seated across from each other, the space between us small but deliberate, as if neither of us wanted to make it feel accidental again. The background noise faded into something distant, cups clinking, muted voices, while her attention stayed steady on me, unhurried and sincere. Conversation came easily, which surprised me. Not the usual small talk I was used to, but something slower, more thoughtful. She asked questions that didn't rush toward answers. When I spoke, she listened without interrupting, her eyes never wandering, her expression open in a way that made me feel oddly safe. It was disarming. I realized I was saying things I usually kept to myself. Uncertain plans, half-formed dreams, the quiet fear of not becoming who I imagined I might be. She didn't try to fix anything. She just nodded, sometimes smiling softly, sometimes growing still. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of experience, not advice delivered from above, but reflections offered gently, as if laid on the table for me to take or leave. She talked about change, about moments when life veers away from expectation, about learning to sit with uncertainty rather than fight it. Listening to her felt like standing near something steady during a long wind. At one point, she laughed, low and warm, at something I said. Without thinking, she reached out and rested her hand briefly on my forearm. The touch was light, almost absent-minded, but it anchored me. Her palm was warm, her fingers relaxed, and when she pulled away, the absence of her touch felt louder than the sound of her laughter. My heart beat faster, not with panic, but with awareness. I noticed the details then. The faint lines at the corners of her eyes when she smiled, earned through years of laughter. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The calm confidence in her posture, balanced by a softness that suggested she hadn't always felt this sure of herself. She wasn't performing ease. She had grown into it. There were pauses in our conversation that didn't feel awkward. Silence settled between us comfortably, like a shared breath. In one of those moments, our eyes met again, and this time there was something unspoken in the space. A recognition that we were drifting into deeper water without meaning to. I felt it then. The subtle tension of closeness, the pull of curiosity layered with restraint. Part of me wanted to step back to keep things light and harmless. But another part of me leaned in, drawn to how present she was, how she made me feel less scattered, more myself. I sensed her hesitation too, not in her words, but in the way her fingers tightened briefly around her cup, the way she held my gaze just long enough to suggest she was thinking carefully about every step. To be why the third time we met, the distance between us had changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed out, but enough that I felt it the moment I sat down beside her. The space she left was smaller now, intentional without being obvious, like an invitation neither of us had spoken aloud. I could feel the warmth of her presence even before we touched, a quiet awareness that settled into my chest. We sat shoulder to shoulder, close enough that I noticed the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. When she shifted slightly, her arm brushed mine, and this time neither of us apologized. The contact was brief, casual on the surface, but it sent a ripple through me. I stayed still, unsure whether to pull away or lean in, and she mirrored that stillness, as if we were both listening to the same unspoken signal. Conversation flowed, but slower now. There were more pauses, moments where words felt unnecessary. When she spoke, she angled her body toward me, one leg tucked beneath her, hands resting loosely in her lap. I caught myself watching the way she moved, unhurried, assured, how every gesture felt deliberate without being calculated. She met my gaze easily, her eyes steady, curious, as though she were quietly studying me too. At one point, our knees brushed under the table. The contact was unmistakable. I felt the warmth through fabric, the gentle pressure where we touched. My instinct was to move away, but I didn't. Neither did she. We continued talking as if nothing had happened, but the awareness stayed, humming beneath every word. It felt like standing at the edge of something, balanced carefully, afraid to tip too far in either direction. I became acutely aware of her scent then, subtle, clean, comforting. It reminded me of calm evenings and open windows, of things settled rather than rushed. When she leaned closer to say something softly, her voice dropped just enough that I felt it more than heard it. The closeness made my thoughts slow, my attention narrowing until there was only her and the space we were sharing. She reached up at one point to adjust a strand of hair that had fallen across her face. Her fingers lingered near her temple, and she glanced at me in a way that felt thoughtful, almost searching. There was no smile this time, just a quiet seriousness that made my chest tighten. It felt as though she was weighing something, me perhaps, and I wondered what she saw when she looked at me like that. When the moment passed, neither of us acknowledged it. But something had shifted. The space between us wasn't just physical anymore. It was charged with possibility. I felt drawn to her in a way that went beyond attraction. Drawn to the calm she carried, the way she made me feel grounded and uncertain all at once. It was after that closeness became familiar that doubt finally found its way in. Not suddenly, not loudly, but quietly, in the spaces where my thoughts usually wandered at night. I started noticing the differences between us more clearly, not in how we connected, but in how the world might see us if it ever stopped to look too closely. She felt it too. I could tell by the way her laughter sometimes softened into something more thoughtful, by how she paused before choosing her words. One evening, we sat together in a quieter place, the light low and warm, shadows stretching lazily across the walls. There was less talking that time, more reflection. She was the first to open that door, not with fear, but with honesty. She spoke about expectations, about how people tend to reduce connections like ours to something simple, something easy to judge. Her voice stayed calm, but I noticed the way her hands folded together, fingers lacing and unlacing slowly. Confidence, I realized, didn't mean she was immune to doubt. It just meant she carried it with grace. I listened, feeling the weight of her words settle in my chest. I thought about my own hesitation, the quiet awareness of where I stood in life, still becoming, still unsure. I wondered what it meant to want someone whose life felt so fully lived, whose presence carried a history I could sense but not fully touch. The difference wasn't intimidating, it was humbling. At some point, the conversation grew heavy, and she leaned toward me without thinking, resting her head gently against my shoulder. The contact was instinctive, unguarded. I felt the warmth of her cheek through my shirt, the subtle shift of her weight as she relaxed there. For a moment, my body tensed, not with discomfort, but with awareness of what that gesture meant. I hesitated before responding, caught between respect and longing. Then, slowly, I lifted my arm and let it settle around her back, my hand resting lightly, careful not to assume more than she offered. She exhaled softly, a sound so quiet it felt meant just for me. The tension in her shoulders eased, and something in my chest did too. We stayed like that for a while, saying nothing. I could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing, the calm strength beneath her closeness. In that moment, the outside world felt distant, muted. There was only the comfort of shared stillness, and the fear that came with knowing how much it meant. Eventually, she straightened, offering me a small smile that carried both gratitude and restraint. Neither of us mentioned what had just happened. We didn't need to. The gesture had spoken clearly enough. It wasn't a crossing of lines, it was a recognition of trust. The evening felt different from the moment it began, as if the air itself had slowed to match the careful pace we were both keeping. Outside, the light had softened into dusk, the sky dimming into shades of blue and gold. Inside, the room was quiet, lamps casting warm circles of light, shadows stretching gently across familiar walls. It felt private without being hidden, intimate without being intentional. We sat close, closer than before, the space between us no longer something to negotiate. Our shoulders touched naturally, comfortably, and neither of us seemed aware of when it had started feeling that way. Conversation drifted in fragments. Unfinished thoughts, quiet observations, until words gradually gave way to silence. Not an awkward silence, but one filled with attention. She turned toward me slightly, one knee angled in my direction. Her movements were unhurried, thoughtful. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, softer, as if she were sharing something fragile. She talked about longing, not naming it directly, but circling it carefully. About moments in life when you realize you want something deeply, even when you're not sure you're allowed to. As she spoke, she reached for my hand. There was no suddenness to it. Her fingers brushed mine first, a question more than a gesture. I felt the warmth of her skin, the faint tremor in her touch. When I didn't pull away, she let her fingers slide between mine, interlacing them slowly, deliberately. The contact sent a quiet pulse through me, grounding and electric all at once. Our hands rested together between us, neither gripping nor loose, just connected. I could feel her thumb move slightly against my knuckle, a small, absent-minded motion that made my breath catch. I became acutely aware of how close she was, of the gentle warmth radiating from her, of the way her presence filled the space around me. Our eyes met then, and the world seemed to narrow to that moment. There was no smile in her expression, only honesty and something like hesitation. She leaned in just enough that I could feel her breath, steady but shallow. Our foreheads hovered inches apart, close enough that I could sense the warmth of her skin, the quiet tension humming between us. For a heartbeat, it felt like we might cross a line neither of us had named. I could feel the pull of it, the ease of letting the moment carry us forward. Instead, she paused. Her eyes closed briefly, as if she were steadying herself, and when she opened them again, there was resolve there alongside the desire. She squeezed my hand gently, then loosened her grip, though she didn't let go. "I needed you to know," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't have to. The truth of it settled between us, heavy and undeniable. When the moment finally broke, it did so softly. No sudden movements, no retreat, just a shared understanding that something real had been acknowledged, even if it wasn't acted upon. As we sat there, hands still lightly touching, I realized how shaken I felt. Not frustrated, not disappointed, just profoundly aware that what we were building mattered too much to rush. We didn't meet again right away after that night. Not because either of us wanted distance, but because we both needed space, to think, to breathe, to understand what had been stirred between us. When we finally did see each other again, there was a quiet seriousness in the air, as if we both knew this conversation mattered more than any we'd had before. We chose a place that felt neutral and calm. Daylight this time, no shadows to hide in. She arrived first, sitting with her hands wrapped loosely around a cup, her posture composed but thoughtful. When she looked up and saw me, her expression softened. Not into a smile, but into something warmer, steadier. Relief, maybe, or recognition. We talked slowly, carefully, about that moment we had nearly crossed, and what it had meant to each of us. I admitted my fear, not of her, but of stepping into something I didn't yet fully understand. I told her how grounded she made me feel, and how unsettling that was at the same time. Speaking it aloud felt like standing in open air after holding my breath for too long. She listened the way she always did, fully present, without interruption. When it was her turn, she spoke with a calm honesty that struck deep. She talked about desire that isn't reckless, about wanting connection that honors where two people are, not just how they feel. She admitted her own hesitation, the responsibility she felt, not out of obligation but care. At one point, emotion caught in her voice, subtle but real. Without thinking, I reached out. My hand paused for a fraction of a second, asking permission even in silence, before she nodded almost imperceptibly. I cupped her cheek gently, my thumb resting along her jaw. Her skin was warm beneath my touch, familiar in a way that surprised me. She leaned into my hand, just slightly, her eyes closing for a brief moment as if grounding herself there. The gesture wasn't about passion. It was about reassurance. About saying, I'm here. I see you. When I let my hand fall away, she opened her eyes and smiled then. Soft, genuine, touched with something like gratitude. We didn't make promises. We didn't define the future in neat terms. Instead, we agreed on something quieter, braver: honesty, patience, the willingness to move forward slowly, without pretending this was simpler than it was. We chose to trust the connection we felt without letting it rush us into something fragile. As we stood to leave, she reached for my hand again, this time without hesitation. Our fingers intertwined easily, naturally, like they already knew where they belonged. She squeezed once, gentle but certain, and in that small gesture, I felt more assurance than any declaration could have given me. What changed after that wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden shift, no grand announcement of what we were to each other. Instead, something quieter settled in, a sense of ease that came from having chosen honesty. We moved forward gently, letting moments unfold without forcing them, trusting the pace we had agreed on. We spent time together in simple ways, walks that stretched longer than planned, conversations that drifted from light to meaningful and back again. Sometimes we sat side by side without speaking at all, comfortable in the shared silence. It was in those moments that I felt it most clearly. Not the thrill of tension, but the warmth of connection that had grown roots. One evening stands out more than the others. The air was cool, the sky soft with fading light. We walked slowly, our hands loosely linked, fingers brushing more than gripping. Every so often, she'd lean into me just slightly, her shoulder finding mine as if by instinct. I thought about how she challenged me without trying to change me, how she made space for my dreams while standing firmly in her own truth. And I knew she saw something in me too. Not potential alone, but presence, willingness, care. When she looked up at me, her eyes were warm, steady. She reached up and brushed her thumb lightly along my cheek, a familiar gesture now, affectionate and grounding. I leaned my forehead against hers, just for a moment, breathing her in, feeling the calm certainty of being exactly where I was meant to be. We didn't need more than that. No declarations. No promises carved in stone. What we had was real because we had built it carefully, through restraint, vulnerability, and choice. If this slow burn story touched something in you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. Share your thoughts. Do you believe emotional connections matter more than age? Your support helps more heartfelt stories like this find their way to you.